The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 1. Tom! Tom! Where are you? There is no answer. Where is this boy? Aunt Polly looked under the bed first. Then she opened the door and looked into the garden. Tom! She heard a voice behind her. She turned that way and came face to face with the boy. So, you are here. What do you have in your pocket? Nothing, Aunt Polly. Come on, show me. What are you hiding? Tom shows his aunt the apples he keeps in his pocket. Oh, Tom, those apples weren't for you. You misbehaved again, didn't you? Aunt Polly, look back, quick! Aunt Polly looked back, but when she turned, Tom was gone. She said to herself, he manages to fool me every time. And she laughed. Everyone in town knew Tom. His mischief bothered everyone, but the townspeople loved him. Aunt Polly loved him too. Tom was her sister's son. After she died, it fell to Aunt Polly to take care of and look after Tom. However, he was certainly not an easy child. But Aunt Polly also had some ways of pacing Tom. Well, she said, it's Saturday, and there's no school tomorrow. But it won't be a holiday for Tom. Tom will have some work to do tomorrow. The weather was beautiful on Saturday. There were flowers in all the gardens. It was a day everyone liked. Tom left his house with a brush and a large can of white paint. He looked at the fence. It was 3 meters high and 30 meters long. He dipped his brush in the paint and painted part of the fence. Then he did it again. Then he stopped and looked at the fence, put down his brush, and sat down. He had a long job ahead of him, and at that moment he felt like the most unhappy kid in town. 10 minutes later, Tom had an idea, a great idea. He picked up the brush again and started working. At that time, he saw his friend Joe Harper on the street, but did not look at him. Joe had a green apple in his hand. He came over to Tom and looked at the fence. I feel bad for you, Tom, he said. Tom didn't say anything. The paintbrush moved up and down. Are you helping your aunt? Said Joe. I'm going down to the river. I'm sorry you can't come with me. Tom put down his brush. You call this a job? He said. Painting the fence? Said Joe. Of course it is work. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I like it, said Tom. I can always go to the river, but I can't always paint fences. Joe watched Tom for about 5 minutes. Tom was painting very slowly and carefully. He often stopped, stepped back from the fence, and looked at his work with a smile. This caught Joe's attention, and he said, Tom, can I paint a little too? Tom thought for a second. Sorry, Joe. My aunt wants me to do it because I'm good at painting. My brother Sid wanted to paint too, but she said no. Oh, please, Tom, just a little bit. I'm also good at painting. Hey, do you want some of my apple? No, Joe, I don't. Okay, you can have all of my apple. Tom handed the brush to Joe. He didn't show it, but he liked it a lot. He sat down and ate Joe's apple. Meanwhile, Tom's other friends also arrived. Their aim was to make fun of Tom, but soon they all wanted to paint. In the afternoon, Tom had 3 balls, an old knife, a one-eyed cat, an old blue bottle, and many other exciting things. He was the richest kid in St. Petersburg town, and the 30-foot fence looked great. He went back home. "Aunt Polly, I finished painting the fence. Can I go play now?" Aunt Polly was surprised. She left the house to look at the fence. She was overjoyed when she saw the beautiful white fence. She thanked Tom and gave him a cookie from the kitchen. "Well, you can go play, but don't be late home," she said. Tom quickly grabbed a second cookie and ran away. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 2. On Monday morning, Tom didn't want to go to school. He wanted to sleep until noon. Aunt Polly forced him out of bed. She helped him get dressed and sent him to school. Tom ran into his friend Huckleberry Finn on the street near the school. Huck had no mother, and his father always drank whiskey, so Huck lived on the streets. He didn't go to school. He was always dirty and never had new clothes. But he was still happy. People in St. Petersburg didn't like Huck, but Tom and his friends loved him. "Hello, Huck," said Tom. "What's in your hand?" "A dead cat." "What are you going to do with it?" asked Tom. Huck said, "I'm taking him to the cemetery tonight," he said. "A dead cat can raise ghosts from their graves at midnight." "I've never heard of that before," said Tom. "Could this be true?" "I do not know," said Huck. "Come with me and see. Are you afraid of ghosts?" "Of course I'm not afraid," said Tom. "Come to my window at 11 at night and meow, and I will go out." Tom was late for school because he ran into Huck and lingered. Everyone was already in the classroom. Tom opened the door of the classroom and entered. The teacher angrily said, "Thomas Sawyer, why are you late again?" Tom started talking, but then he suddenly stopped. There was a new girl at school, a beautiful girl with blue eyes and long blonde hair. Tom couldn't take his eyes off the girl. How beautiful! And in 2 seconds, Tom fell in love. He wanted to sit next to her, but how? There was only one empty chair on the girl's side, and that was next to the new girl. Tom thought quickly and then looked at the teacher. "I stopped to talk to Huckleberry Finn," he said. The teacher was very angry. Boys were often late for school. That was bad. But talking to Huckleberry Finn was worse, much worse. The teacher wanted to give Tom a punishment. "Now, Tom Sawyer, go sit on the girls' side," he said. Some of the children laughed. Tom walked to the chair next to the new girl, sat down, and opened his book. The other children began to read the book in front of them again. After a while, the girl lifted her head. There was an apple on the table, right in front of her. She put the apple back on Tom's side. A minute later, the apple was in front of her again. Then Tom drew a picture of a house and placed it in front of the girl. "Good," said the girl. "Now draw a man." Tom drew a man near the house. The man was taller than the house and had very large hands and very long legs. but the girl still liked it and asked, "Can you draw me now?" Tom drew a girl next to the man. "You draw beautifully. I can't draw." "I can teach you after school." "Please, I would like it so much." "What is your name?" "Becky Thatcher." Just then, Tom felt a hand on his head. It was the teacher's hand. He grabbed Tom by the ear and led him to the boy's side. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 3. That night, Tom went to bed at 9:30, but he couldn't sleep. He waited for Huck to meow, and at 11 o'clock he heard the sound. He slipped out of the bedroom window silently. He and Huck left town with the dead cat. The cemetery was on a hill about 2 kilometers from St. Petersburg. When the children got there, they put the dead cat in a grave and sat behind the trees. They watched and waited. It was very dark and very quiet. "See the new tomb over there?" whispered Huck. "This is Hoss Williams' grave. He died last week." "Maybe he can hear us," whispered Tom. "Do you think that's possible, Huck?" "I don't know, but Shh! What happened, Tom?" "I see something. Look this way." Huck approached Tom. "Ghosts!" he said. "3 of them. They're coming here, Tom. Oh, let's go home." "They can't see us here," whispered Tom. "Ghosts can see through trees," Huck said, frightened. "They can see everything." The ghosts passed silently through the cemetery and approached the trees. Huck and Tom were terrified. They watched them in silence. After a minute or so, Huck said, "Tom, they are not ghosts. This is Muff Potter." "Yes, he is, and that's Injun Joe. The other man is Dr. Robinson. What are they doing here?" "I think they're grave robbers, Tom. They will rob the grave. My father told me. The doctor wants a corpse to cut out." "Shh! They're approaching." The 3 men stood at Hoss Williams' grave, and Injun Joe and Muff Potter began digging. 10 minutes later, they opened the tomb. "Now, doctor," said Muff Potter, "you want us to take the body to your house? You have to pay another $5 for it." "No," said the doctor. "I just gave you money this morning. I can't give any more." "Now listen to me, doctor," said Injun Joe. "I want that money. Do you remember a day 5 years ago? I came to your house and asked you for something to eat. You didn't give me anything. Now give me that money." He grabbed the doctor's arm, but the doctor suddenly hit him, and Injun Joe fell to the ground. Muff Potter jumped on the doctor, and the 2 men started fighting. It all happened very quickly, and the 2 boys watched with wide mouths. Injun Joe stood up. Now he had Muff Potter's knife in his hand and got behind the doctor. Then the doctor hit Muff Potter on the head. Muff fell to the ground, and at the same time, Injun Joe stabbed the knife in the doctor's back. The doctor fell to the ground on Muff Potter and never moved again. The 2 boys could not watch any longer. Very quietly, they moved away from the trees and then out of the cemetery. They ran back to town. Injun Joe stopped by Hoss Williams' grave and looked at the 2 men on the ground. Then He stuck the knife in Muff Potter's hand and sat down. A few minutes passed. Potter moved a little and opened his eyes. What happened, Joe? He asked. Not good stuff, Muff, said Joe. Why did you kill him? Muff looked at the doctor's body, then at the knife in his hand. Me? Did I kill him? His face turned white, and the knife fell from his hand. It must be whiskey, Joe. I usually never fight with a knife. Oh, why did I drink all that whiskey tonight? I don't remember anything. It's okay, Muff, said Joe. I won't tell anyone. You go now. Muff Potter stood up and ran away. Joe watched him for a minute, then carefully placed the knife next to the doctor's body. Then he left the cemetery too. The next day, the sheriff's men found the doctor's body and Muff Potter's knife in the cemetery. That night, Muff came to the cemetery to get his knife. But the sheriff's men were there and saw him. They took Muff to St. Petersburg's little prison. Muff stayed there for 4 weeks, awaiting his trial. Tom and Huck never forgot that night at the cemetery. They were very unhappy and very scared. What are we gonna do? Said Tom. Muff Potter didn't kill the doctor. Injun Joe did. We saw him. I know, said Huck. But what can we do? We can't tell anyone. I'm afraid of Injun Joe. He is a dangerous man, and moreover, now he is a murderer. Would you like a knife in your back? No, of course I wouldn't. I'm afraid of that man too, said Tom. He thought for a minute. I'm sorry about Muff Potter, but you're right, Huck. We can't tell anyone about Injun Joe, he said. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 4. Summer vacation came, and there was no school any more. Tom didn't want to think about Muff Potter and Injun Joe, but it wasn't easy. When he was in bed at night, he could see the face of Injun Joe in the dark and could not sleep. But he couldn't talk about it with anyone. He and Joe Harper were on the Mississippi River on a hot summer day. They sat and watched the boats, fished, and chatted. "Let's get away from here," said Tom suddenly. "Let's go and do something exciting somewhere." "Okay," said Joe. "But what shall we do? And where?" "I know," said Tom. "Let's run away. Let's go and live on Jackson Island. We can sleep under the trees." Jackson Island was in the Mississippi, 3 miles south of St. Petersburg. It was a deserted place. There was nobody. "Let's ask Huck Finn, too," said Tom. "But don't tell your parents or anyone. Go home and get something to eat. Meet me here at midnight." That night, in a small boat, the 3 children went downriver to Jackson Island. They had some bread and some meat. Huck even had a pipe. When they got there, they carried everything to the island and made a fire under a big old tree. Then they cooked some of the meat on the fire. The meat was very good. It was the most delicious dinner in the world. They soon stopped talking, closed their eyes and fell asleep. The next morning, Tom woke up with the sun on his head and a smile on his face. Then Huck and Joe woke up, and the three boys ran to the river for a swim. After that, they started fishing and soon caught 6 big fish. They cooked the fish on the fire and ate it all. They were very hungry. "This," said Joe happily, "was a great breakfast." After breakfast, they walked around the island, swam some more, talked, fished, and swam again. They returned to the campsite in the afternoon. Tom suddenly lifted his head and said, "Listen, can you hear the boats?" They listened and then ran across the island to look down the river. There were 20 or more boats in the water. All the boats in St. Petersburg were there. "What are they doing?" asked Joe. "I think they're looking for a body," said Huck. "They did this last summer when Bill Turner fell into the river and drowned." "Who do you think died this time?" asked Joe. After a short silence, Tom suddenly shouted, "I know who died! We died! They're looking for us!" That was great. Tom looked at his friends. "We are famous now," he said. "Everyone in St. Petersburg is talking about us, and they all feel sorry for us." After sunset, they sat by the river, ate, and chatted a little. In the following hours, Huck and Joe fell asleep. But Tom didn't sleep, and in the morning he wasn't there. "Huck, where is Tom?" cried Joe. "I don't know," said Huck. "But look, there he is. He is swimming towards the island. Hey, Tom!" At breakfast, Tom told his friends where he was. "I went home last night," he said, "and I listened through the window. Your mother was there too, Joe. He and Aunt Polly wept. I heard very interesting things. There will be a big funeral for us at church on Sunday. Listen, I have a great idea." Huck and Joe listened and laughed, and yes, that was a great idea. That night, the boys cooked some more fish, and after dinner, Huck took out his pipe and began to smoke. "Can we smoke too?" asked Tom. "I want to learn too." Huck also made pipes for Tom and Joe, and the 3 children sat and smoked. "Hey, I like smoking a pipe," said Tom. "It's easy." "Very easy," said Joe. "I am going to smoke every day." But after 10 minutes, Tom and Joe got even quieter, and their faces took on an interesting color. "I'm going to go for a walk," said Tom. He stood up and walked carefully into the trees. Joe followed too. The children returned after a while, but they never wanted to smoke a pipe again. There were no happy faces in St. Petersburg on Sunday morning. Aunt Polly, Joe's mom and dad, and all the boys' friends were at church. The minister said very nice things about the 3 boys, and their families wept and wept. Everyone cried. Little Becky Thatcher didn't stop crying for a second. A small noise came from the door of the church, but at first no one heard it. Then the minister looked in that direction and suddenly stopped speaking. Everyone looked back. Their mouths opened and remained open, and 3 dead children entered the church First Tom, then Joe, and then Huck. For a moment, no one moved or spoke, but then the noise started. Aunt Polly and Joe's mother ran to the children and took them in their arms. Aunt Polly cried and laughed and cried again. "Oh, Tom," she said, "you are a bad boy, but I love you." The minister suddenly said, "Oh, happy days! Sing, beautiful people of St. Petersburg! Sing and be happy!" And everyone sang for a long time, smiled and laughed. It was St. Petersburg's happiest funeral. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 5. A few days later, the judge arrived in St. Petersburg. The day before Muff Potter's trial, Huck and Tom met on the street near Tom's house. Huck was unhappy. "Tom, you didn't tell anyone, did you?" "No, I didn't mention it." "But what about Muff? People say he's the murderer. They will hang him." "But we can't tell anyone about Injun Joe," Huck said. "I don't want to die either. Do you want?" No, Tom didn't want to die. But he couldn't forget Muff Potter's face in prison either. Old, tired, and unhappy. Injun Joe was a free man. This was not true. That night, Tom came home late and was very nervous. He was constantly thinking about what happened. He was trying to find a solution. The next morning, the whole town was at Muff Potter's trial. Injun Joe was also there. Muff waited, a tired old man with a dirty face. The judge began the trial. Questions, questions, questions. Answers, 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 and the answers were all bad for Muff Potter. "Yes, I found the knife in the cemetery, next to Dr. Robinson's body." "Yeah, that's Muff Potter's knife. He always carries it." "Yes, I saw Muff Potter in the town that afternoon. He had a knife with him then." Muff Potter started to look more and more unhappy. Then the judge said, "Bring Thomas Sawyer." People stood up. What did young Tom Sawyer know? Everyone looked at him and waited. "Thomas Sawyer, where were you at midnight on the 17th of June?" "In the cemetery." "Why?" "I went there to see ghosts with a dead cat." The people of St. Petersburg laughed, but the judge looked angry. "And where were you standing in the cemetery, Thomas?" "Behind the trees, next to Hoss Williams' grave." Injun Joe's face suddenly turned white. "Now, my son," said the judge, "tell us your story." And so Tom told his story. People listened to him with their mouths opened. Then Muff Potter fell to the ground, and then Injun Joe jumped up with the knife, and in an instant, Injun Joe smashed the window and threw himself out, and within seconds, he was out of sight. Everyone was very surprised. The sheriff and his men ran after Injun Joe, but were unable to find him. He disappeared very quickly. Tom couldn't sleep for days. That man was dangerous and not in jail. Weeks passed. There was no news of Injun Joe. The townspeople and Tom gradually began to forget about him. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 6. Tom was good at creating fun and excitement for himself. Yes, he got in trouble from time to time, but for him, life without adventure was very boring. That afternoon, it occurred to him to seek treasure. After all, robbers hid some of what they stole somewhere, and Tom had to find it. He went to Huck and told his thoughts. Huck liked the treasure idea. "Where are we going to dig?" he asked. "An old tree is the best place," said Tom. "Who puts treasure under old trees?" "The robbers," said Tom. "And then they go away, or forget to come back to get the treasure." "There's an old tree on Cardiff Hill," Huck said. "Let's go there. I have an old pickaxe and shovel." The weather was very hot. They walked for a long time. The old tree was about another 5 kilometers away. The children were tired and sweaty. When they got there, they sat for a while under the tree and rested. Then they started digging. They dug for an hour or two. However, they found nothing. Then they stopped. Tom saw an old house at the foot of the hill. "Hey, look," said Tom. "There is an old house over there. Do you see?" "Yes, I saw it," Huck said. "I don't think anyone lives there. Let's go there," said Tom. "Old houses are always treasure places." "They're also places for ghosts," said Huck. They took the pick and shovel with them, went down the hill, and entered the old house. They started searching around, but there was no treasure, no ghost. Then they heard a voice. "Shh!" said Tom suddenly. "What is that?" "Ghosts!" Huck whispered. There were holes in the floor, and the children could see the rooms downstairs through these holes. "No," whispered Tom. "2 men. One is old Spaniard. I saw him in town last week. I don't know the other man. Let's be quiet and listen." The 2 men sat on the ground. The Spaniard had a green hat and long white hair. The other man was small and dark. He took out a bag and began to open it. "It's so hot in here," the Spaniard said. He took off his green hat. The children could now see his face clearly. "Tom, this is Injun Joe," whispered Huck. The second man said, "We got $650 when we robbed that house." He took some money out of the bag. "We can take $50 with us for now." "What are we going to do with 600? "Leave it here," said Injun Joe. "We'll come and get it next week. Hand me the bag." He walked across the room to the fireplace, picked up the 2 large stones from the floor, and began digging the ground with his knife. Upstairs, the 2 children were watching with excitement. Treasure! $600 of wonderful treasure! Injun Joe stopped digging. "Whoa! What is this?" he said. "There is something here. It's an old box." The 2 men took out the box and opened it. "Money!" said Injun Joe's friend excitedly. Injun Joe put his hand in the box. "There are thousands of dollars here," he said, and the 2 men looked at the money with happy smiles. "But who—" began Injun Joe's friend. "Don't ask," said Injun Joe. "It's our money now." "We can't take it with us today," said his friend. "What can we do about it? Are you going to put it back under the ground?" "Yes," said Injun Joe, Happy faces upstairs. No! Very unhappy faces upstairs. Let's put it under the cross. Nobody goes there. We can take it there tonight. When night fell, the two men carried all the money. The children did not go after them because they were afraid of Injun Joe, but they wanted very much to find that cross. The two boys spent a week thinking about the treasure. It was under the cross, but where was the cross? The children watched the Spaniard intently, but they did not see a cross and did not find the treasure either. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 7. Next Saturday was Becky Thatcher's birthday, and all of Becky's friends were so excited. "It will be a great day," said Becky to Tom. "We will have a picnic by the river. After that, we can visit McDougal's cave." In the morning, a big boat took Becky, Tom, and all their friends down the river. All parents stayed at home. After all, it was the children's day, and it was a very happy, noisy picnic. After the picnic, the children took out their candles and ran up the hill into the cave. The mouth of the cave was dark, and some of the children were frightened at first. But caves are exciting, so eventually everyone got in. McDougal's cave was a very, very large cave with hundreds of tunnels and chambers. The tunnels would go up and down for miles. You can walk for days in this cave. No one knew the whole cave, but many knew about the tunnels near the gate. Of course, Tom knew them well, too. The children walked through the cave for hours. They wandered up and down the tunnels, in and out of the rooms. In the evening, they went out and walked down the hill to the boat, tired but happy. It was dark when the boat returned to St. Petersburg. Huck Finn saw the boat, but didn't know about the picnic. Of course, he didn't go to the birthday picnic because St. Petersburg's mothers didn't like him. But tonight, Huck was only interested in the treasure, Injun Joe's treasure. Injun Joe was in an old building by the river. Huck waited in the street near the building. Perhaps, he thought, Injun Joe's cross is there, and the money box too. I have to wait and watch. I can tell Tom tomorrow. But Injun Joe didn't come out. At midnight, it began to rain, and Huck waited all night in the cold street. In the morning, he could not move and speak. He felt the cold, then the heat, then the cold, then the heat again. Mrs. Douglas, a woman from the church, found him on the street. She took him home and laid him on the bed. And he stayed there for 2 weeks. He was very sick, and therefore did not hear the news about Tom and Becky. But on Sunday morning, all of St. Petersburg was talking about Tom and Becky, because they were not on the boat when the boat returned to the town. Where were they? Are they lost in the cave? Were they alive or did they die? On the picnic day, at first, Tom and Becky played with their friends in the cave. Then Tom wanted to go down a new tunnel, and Becky went with him. They walked, talked, and entered a second tunnel, then a third. Every now and then, Tom put up signs on the walls. He wanted to find the mouth of the cave again. Then they emerged through the tunnels into a large room. There were hundreds of bats in this room, and the candles woke them up. Tom took Becky's hand, and they ran to the nearest tunnel with the bats behind them. But a bat slammed into Becky's candle, and it went out. The children ran through the tunnels and finally got rid of the bats. They stopped and sat. All of a sudden, it got very, very quiet. "Where are we now, Tom?" Becky whispered, frightened. "I don't know," said Tom. "I think it's time to go back, but we can't get through that big room because of the bats. Let's go down this tunnel." They went down a tunnel, then a second, third, fourth tunnel. Then they tried to find the big room with the bats again, but they couldn't. Becky began to cry, "Tom, we can't go out! We're lost! Tom, we're lost!" They walked and walked. They sat down when they were tired. Then they got up and walked again. They lost track of time. Was it day or night? They didn't know. Then Tom wanted to find water. They had nothing to eat, but they had to have something to drink. They found a very small river and sat next to it. "Becky," said Tom, "we should stay here by the river. This is our last candle and—" He didn't finish his sentence, but Becky got it. "Tom." "Yes, Becky?" "Will they come and look for us?" "Of course, when the boat arrived in St. Petersburg." "But how can they find us in these hundreds of tunnels? Oh, Tom, Tom, we're going to die here!" Becky started crying again. Then the candle went out, and the two children were left in the dark. They sat for hours. They slept a little, then woke up, then slept again. Was it Sunday now, or is it Monday? Tom stood up suddenly. "Listen! Someone is calling!" The two children listened. They heard it a little closer. They answered the voice. Then they started walking down the tunnel in the dark with their hands against the wall. They stopped and listened again, but now they couldn't hear anything. Gradually, they returned to their river. They fell asleep again and woke up very, very hungry. "Maybe today is Tuesday," thought Tom. "What can I do? I must do something." Then an idea occurred to him. "Becky, listen. I have a long rope in my pocket. I can go down small tunnels and rope back. You wait here." Tom descended slowly and carefully from the first tunnel on his hands and knees. Then the tunnel wall on his right was gone, and there was nothing. Tom reached out to feel the ground, and just then he saw a hand to his right, a hand holding a candle. "Help!" Tom cried immediately. The hand moved, and Tom saw an arm and a face. It was Injun Joe! Tom was very scared, but Injun Joe was also scared, and he quickly ran down the tunnel. Tom returned to Becky, but did not tell her about Injun Joe. An hour or so later, he entered a different tunnel with his rope, then a third tunnel. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 8. It was Tuesday evening, and St. Petersburg was waiting. Most of the villagers were in the cave and searched for the children day and night, but they heard nothing, saw nothing, and found nothing. Then, later that evening, there was a sudden noise in the streets. People started running to the Thatcher's house. "They are here! Becky and Tom are here!" Most of the townspeople came to hear Tom's story. "I was in the 6th tunnel," he said to them. "I went all the way to the end of my rope, and suddenly I could see the light of day. There was a small hole in the cave wall. I stuck my head out and saw the river right under my nose. I came back, got Becky, and we went out of the hole. Then we stopped a boat on the river. We were 7 or 8 kilometers away from the mouth of the cave." Tom was very tired after 3 days in the cave. He went to bed and stayed there for 2 full days. He heard that Huck was sick. He went to see Huck that Sunday and every day thereafter. "You can just say hello," Mrs. Douglas said to Tom. "Then you have to go. Huck is very sick and needs to sleep." That's why Tom couldn't talk about his exciting adventures and tell Huck about Injun Joe. One day, about 2 weeks after the picnic, Tom was at Becky's house, and Becky's father walked in. "Well, Tom," said Mr. Thatcher, "do you want to go back to the cave someday?" "I am not afraid of that cave," said Tom. Mr. Thatcher laughed. "You are a brave boy, Tom, but no one can enter the cave again. Now there are big doors at the mouth of the cave, and no one can open them." Tom's face turned white. "But Mr. Thatcher, Injun Joe is in that cave." An hour later there were 50 men in the cave, and they opened the doors. Injun Joe was on the ground, dead, facing the door, knife in his hand. The day after Injun Joe's funeral, Huck got out of bed. He and Tom walked slowly out of town. They had a long talk, and Huck heard all about the picnic, the cave, and Injun Joe. "We will never find the money now," said Huck. "Huck," said Tom, "the money is not in St. Petersburg. I know it's in the cave." "Why was Injun Joe in the cave?" "Because he took the money box over there." Huck looked excited. "Really, Tom?" "The money is in the cave, and we can easily reach it. Let's go there now. I have some candles and a long rope. We can take a boat and then put it back." 20 minutes later, the boys were in a boat in the Mississippi. They went 12 kilometers down the river, and then Tom stopped by a few small trees. "Here," he said. Tom's hole was just behind the trees. Tom took a candle and went inside. Huck climbed after him. "Injun Joe never found this hole," Tom said. "Or he found it but couldn't get through. It's too narrow." The children carefully went through the tunnels with their ropes. Then Tom stopped. "I saw Injun Joe around here," he said. "And look, Huck! There's the cross!" There was a large cross on the tunnel wall. The children looked up and down the tunnel, but there was no box full of money. "Injun Joe said it was under the cross," said Tom. "Maybe it's underground. Look, we can move these stones." The boys took their knives and began digging along the side of the tunnel wall. They soon found a second, smaller tunnel under the wall. They went downstairs and came to a small room. There was a bed, 2 whiskey bottles, some old shoes, and a chest. The chest was locked. They tried, but couldn't open it. They did not have the necessary tools with them. They took the chest with them and returned to town. When someone finds a treasure, everyone hears very quickly. 2 children carried the chest through the town. When they arrived at Aunt Polly's house, almost half the town was with them. Aunt Polly was surprised to see the people in her garden. Then she saw Tom and Huck. They were carrying something in their hands. "Oh, Tom," said Aunt Polly, "what is that old chest? What's in it?" Tom and Huck put the chest on the table. Aunt Polly and the townspeople gathered around the table. They were waiting eagerly. Tom brought the toolbox from inside. After a bit of fiddling with it, Huck and Tom unlocked the chest. A wonderful surprise awaited them when they lifted the lid up. There was much more money in the chest than they anticipated. $12,000, to be exact. That's when Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn became the richest people in St. Petersburg. The end.